Well, there's a point where it's like, it's out of my control.
Yes.
There's literally nothing I can do about it.
Yeah.
And when people say, but you can adopt. I don't want to adopt.
All the years and years and years of speculation, it was really hard. I was going through IVF, drinking Chinese teas, you name it. I was throwing everything at it. I would have given anything if someone had said to me, freeze your eggs, do yourself a favor. So here I am today. The ship has sailed. Those were the words of Jennifer Aniston, spoken quietly, without bitterness, without performance, in October of 2025. And when the world finally heard them, something shifted. Not in the loud, dramatic way the tabloid machine had always promised, but in the way that real truth tends to land. Slowly, heavily, and with the full weight of everything it has been carrying. For 20 years, the world believed a story about Jennifer Aniston. It was a story told in headlines, in television panel discussions, in whispered commentary on red carpets and magazine covers. It was a story about a woman who had everything: beauty, talent, wealth, an empire built from one of the most beloved television shows in history, and who had still, somehow, chosen wrong, who had put her career first, who had been too selfish, too ambitious, too difficult to stop and do what women are supposed to do. The story was repeated so many times, it became fact. It was delivered with sympathy when they wanted to seem kind, and with judgment when they didn't bother. It followed her through 2 marriages and 2 divorces. It followed her through every birthday, every award season, every quiet Sunday photographed through a telephoto lens. It became the defining narrative of her public life. The thing people always mentioned first, always wondered about, always used to measure her against some invisible standard she had never agreed to meet. But here is what the world did not know. Here is what Jennifer Aniston was doing, privately, quietly, in the years when the cameras were not watching, while that story was being written about her without her permission. She was trying. She was trying with everything she had, and nobody knew. How does a woman endure 2 decades of public judgment for a decision she never made, while privately living through the heartbreak of the very thing the world said she didn't want? That is the story Jennifer Aniston finally told out loud. And that is the story we are here to honor tonight. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with fanfare or press releases. It does not come dressed in the language of empowerment or the choreography of a public redemption arc. It arrives quietly, in an interview chair, in a podcast studio, in the careful selection of words by a woman who has spent a lifetime learning exactly how much the wrong sentence can cost her. Jennifer Aniston was 56 years old when she finally said it out loud, October of 2025. 2 separate conversations, one with Harper's Bazaar UK, one with Dax Shepard on the Armchair Expert podcast, and in both of them, she said the same essential thing in 2 different ways, as though she had been holding it so long that it needed more than one door to finally leave the room. To Harper's Bazaar, she said it with the quiet firmness of someone setting a boundary she should never have needed to set. They didn't know my story or what I'd been going through over the past 20 years to try to pursue a family, because I don't go out there and tell them my medical woes. That's not anybody's business. To Dax Shepard, she said it with something closer to exhaustion, the kind that only settles in once the weight is finally down. All the years and years and years of speculation, it was really hard. I was going through IVF, drinking Chinese teas, you name it. I was throwing everything at it. 2 decades, 20 years of trying in private, while the world narrated a completely different story in public. 20 years of clinic appointments and hormone protocols and hope and grief, and the particular silence of a woman who had decided that her medical life was not content for other people's entertainment, and who had paid for that decision with her reputation, her public image, and a level of sustained mischaracterization that would have broken someone less quietly formidable. She did not cry when she said it. She did not perform catharsis for the audience. She simply said what was true, in the same steady voice she has always used when something matters enough to be spoken carefully. And the world, to its credit, finally went quiet long enough to listen. There is no version of this story that is not, in some measure, an indictment, not of any single person, not of any single publication, but of the entire machinery that decided a woman's worth could be calculated by whether or not she had produced a child by a certain age, and that her silence on the matter was itself a confession of guilt. Jennifer Aniston never confessed. She simply declined to participate, and for that, she was tried in absentia for 20 years by a court she had never agreed to stand before. That she emerged from it with her dignity intact is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. Every legend begins somewhere before the legend. Before the lights, before the laugh track, before the cover of every magazine in every airport in the Western world. There is always a child who does not yet know what she is going to become, living in circumstances that would not suggest it. Jennifer Joanna Aniston was born on the 11th of February, 1969, in Sherman Oaks, California. She came into the world as the daughter of two people who were, in their own ways, performers, which is to say, she came into the world already surrounded by the particular instability that the performing life tends to generate in everything adjacent to it, including marriages, including childhoods, including the quiet interior life of a little girl trying to understand what was expected of her. Her father was John Aniston, a working actor of Greek descent, whose career was defined less by stardom and more by the steady, disciplined craft of a man who showed up, did the work, and built a life from consistency rather than headlines. He would eventually become best known for his long-running role on the soap opera Days of Our Lives, a role he held with remarkable dedication for decades, becoming in his own right a beloved and respected figure in the industry. He was, by most accounts, a man of warmth and steadiness. He was also, by the time Jennifer was 9 years old, gone from the family home. The divorce came in 1978. Jennifer was 9. And there is something particularly precise about that age. Old enough to understand that something has broken, young enough to spend the rest of your childhood trying to figure out whether you were somehow the reason. John Aniston moved out. He remarried. He had another son. And Jennifer, by her own later admission, spent years carrying the particular ache of a father who was present in the world, but not always present in her life in the way she needed him to be. Her mother was Nancy Dow, actress, model, a woman of striking physical beauty and strong opinions about the importance of that beauty in the world. Nancy raised Jennifer largely on her own after the divorce, first in Los Angeles, and then, in a move that would shape Jennifer's sensibility and ambition in ways she perhaps only understood later, in New York City. They moved when Jennifer was a young girl into the particular intensity of Manhattan, into a life that was smaller in square footage and larger in everything else. New York did something to Jennifer Aniston that Los Angeles perhaps could not have. It gave her texture. It gave her the particular toughness that comes from navigating a city that does not adjust itself for you, that demands you figure out your own way through, or get moved aside by someone who already has. She attended the Fiorello H. LaGuardia High School of Music and Art and Performing Arts, the real school that inspired the movie and television series Fame, where she studied drama alongside students who were, even at 17 and 18, ferociously talented and ferociously competitive. It was not a gentle environment. It was not designed to be. What it was designed to do was find out who wanted it badly enough to survive it. And Jennifer Aniston, quiet and observant and more resilient than she perhaps appeared, wanted it badly enough. Her relationship with her mother during these years was, by her own description, complicated in the way that only a mother-daughter relationship can be complicated, which is to say, deeply, and in ways that take decades to fully understand. Nancy Dow had opinions about Jennifer's appearance, strong ones, delivered with the particular authority of a woman who had built her own identity around beauty and believed she was passing on something useful, something protective, when she offered her daughter corrections and comparisons and the steady, low-level pressure of maternal standards that were never quite met. Jennifer later reflected with careful honesty, "My mom and I always had sort of a push and pull kind of a relationship. It didn't instill a lot of security in how I felt about my physical appearance, just because she was kind of always telling me what to do and how to do it." That is a quiet sentence about a loud wound. The girl who would one day be called the most beautiful woman in America grew up in a home where her appearance was not a given, not a comfort, but a project, something that required management, improvement, attention. She grew up understanding that how she looked was something other people had opinions about, and that those opinions carried weight, and that she could not always predict what the verdict would be. It is perhaps not surprising, then, that she developed early the habit of watching, of reading rooms, of anticipating reactions, of understanding other people's emotional weather before it arrived. These are the survival skills of a child who has learned that the adults around her are not entirely predictable. They are also, it turns out, the precise skills required to play a character so beloved that she becomes, for 10 years, the emotional center of the most watched television show on the planet. The girl from Sherman Oaks did not know that yet. She was still just a girl, navigating a divorce, navigating New York, navigating a mother who loved her in a way that sometimes felt more like pressure than comfort, trying to find the shape of herself in circumstances that were not always kind enough to help. But she was already, in all the ways that mattered, becoming exactly who she was going to be. And what happens when the girl who grew up doubting her own reflection becomes the face that an entire generation decides is perfect? There are careers that build slowly, brick by brick, over years of quiet accumulation. And then there are careers that simply detonate, that go from promising to historic in the space of a single season before the person at the center of them has fully processed what is happening or what it will cost. Jennifer Aniston's career was the second kind. She had spent the late 1980s and early 1990s doing what young actors in Los Angeles do, auditioning, waiting, taking the parts that were available, building the craft in the margins of other people's projects. She had a recurring role on the sitcom Married with Children. She appeared in a handful of films that did not set the world on fire. She worked consistently, which in Hollywood is itself a form of success, but she had not yet found the thing that would define her. She had not yet found Rachel Green. Friends premiered on NBC on the 22nd of September, 1994. 6 young actors, 1 apartment, 1 coffee shop, a premise that should not, by any reasonable measure, have worked as well as it did, and that proceeded to work so well that it rewired the cultural conversation for an entire decade. Jennifer Aniston played Rachel Green, a character who began the series as a runaway bride fleeing a life of comfortable privilege, and who became, over 10 seasons, something far more complicated and far more beloved. Rachel was funny and vain and fiercely loyal and occasionally oblivious, and always, somehow, exactly the person you wanted to be watching. She was aspirational without being unreachable. She was flawed without being unsympathetic. She was, in the hands of Jennifer Aniston, completely and utterly alive. The show ran from 1994 to 2004. At its peak, it drew 32 million viewers per episode in the United States alone. It was sold to broadcasters in 150 countries. It became, in the fullest sense of the phrase, a global phenomenon. The kind of cultural event that does not merely entertain an audience, but actually shapes it, gives it references and language, and a shared emotional landscape that persists for decades after the final episode airs. Jennifer Aniston won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actress in a comedy series in 2002. She won the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a television series, musical or comedy, in 2003. She was, by any measurable standard, one of the most successful television actresses in the history of the medium. And then she met Brad Pitt. They were introduced in 1998 through their respective agents, a meeting so mundane in its logistics that it seems almost unfair given the magnitude of what it would eventually generate, both in happiness and in devastation. Brad Pitt was, at that moment, one of the most famous men on Earth. Fight Club was still a year away. Seven was already behind him. He was the kind of famous that makes ordinary life a permanent negotiation. Every restaurant, every sidewalk, every quiet evening, out a potential event. Jennifer was no stranger to that level of visibility herself. But there is something about two people at that altitude finding each other that creates its own particular gravity. They dated. They fell in love, by all accounts genuinely and without performance. They married on the 29th of July, 2000, in a ceremony in Malibu that cost $1 million and involved a guest list of 200 people and a level of media frenzy that required helicopters to be kept at a distance by a no-fly zone. It was, in the language of that particular cultural moment, a fairy tale. The most beautiful man in Hollywood and America's girl next door. A match so aesthetically and narratively satisfying that the tabloid industry practically wept with gratitude. And with the fairy tale came the question. The question that would not leave. The question that would define the next 20 years of Jennifer Aniston's public life in ways she could not yet anticipate. When are you having children? It began as curiosity. It escalated to obsession. Every interview, every red carpet, every magazine profile, the bump watch, that particular indignity in which photographers and editors scan a woman's midsection in every available photograph, searching for evidence, ready to report. Brad Pitt did not help matters when, in the period before the separation, he told CNN with apparent casual sincerity, "It's time. We've been in rehearsals long enough." He said this publicly, about their life together, about the future he imagined, and the media took it as confirmation of a plan, as a promise of a timeline, as evidence that children were coming and that Jennifer Aniston would be their mother. She was, at that precise moment, already trying, already in the early stages of what would become 20 years of private struggle, already navigating the medical reality that the world was busy narrating as a personal choice. She never corrected them. She never explained. She considered her medical life to be her own, a position that is, by any reasonable standard, entirely correct. And she held that position with a composure that must have cost her considerably more than it appeared to. In 2004, Brad Pitt filmed Mr. and Mrs. Smith alongside Angelina Jolie. By the time the film wrapped, something had shifted. Something that Brad himself later acknowledged in the careful and insufficient language that public figures use when they are trying to be honest without being entirely accountable. Their mutual friend Courtney Cox later confirmed to Vanity Fair that Brad had been honest with Jennifer about his attraction to Angelina. The divorce was announced in January of 2005. It was finalized in October of that same year. What followed was one of the most sustained and merciless media spectacles that any private person, and Jennifer Aniston, whatever her fame, was a private person in the ways that mattered, has ever been subjected to. The narrative was assembled quickly and efficiently by a press that had already decided the shape of the story, before it had all the facts. Jennifer had refused to have children. Jennifer had prioritized her career. Jennifer had been too focused on herself to give Brad what he wanted. And Brad, now publicly involved with Angelina Jolie, who had children, who was photographed holding children, who projected the image of a woman who had made the correct choices, became the emblem of everything Jennifer had supposedly failed to provide. In November of 2005, Jennifer was in the middle of a television interview when the host informed her, in real time, that Angelina Jolie was pregnant with Brad Pitt's child. By multiple accounts, she cried. She was not crying because Brad Pitt was having a child with someone else. She was crying because she was a human being, ambushed in public, while privately fighting for the very thing the world had decided she didn't want. And still she did not explain. Still she held the line. Still she considered her medical life to be her own business, and the world's fascination with it to be something she was not required to service. It was not stubbornness, it was not pride, it was dignity, and it was completely, entirely, devastatingly correct. There is a particular kind of grief that has no public language. It is not the grief of loss that other people can see, not the grief of a funeral or a diagnosis delivered in a hospital room or a relationship that ends in a way the world can witness and acknowledge and respond to with casseroles and condolence cards. It is the grief of the thing that did not happen, the grief of the appointment that came back with the wrong result, the grief of trying, month after month, year after year, with everything you have and everything medicine can offer, and still arriving again and again at the same door, which will not open. Jennifer Aniston lived inside that grief for 20 years, and she lived inside it alone, in the sense that matters most. Not physically alone, not without doctors or support, but alone in the way that a person is alone when they have decided that their pain is theirs to carry, that the world does not have the right to it, and that silence, however costly, is the only form of protection available. She began trying to have children during her marriage to Brad Pitt. The timeline she revealed in October of 2025 makes this clear. 20 years of pursuit places the beginning squarely in the early years of the 2000s, in the middle of the marriage that the world had already decided was a fairy tale and was therefore entitled to a fairy tale ending, complete with children photographed in expensive gardens for magazine spreads. The world wanted the next chapter. Jennifer Aniston was in a clinic, hoping for it too, in ways the world would not know about for 2 decades. IVF, in vitro fertilization. The clinical name for a process that is, in human terms, one of the most physically and emotionally demanding things a person can undertake. It begins with hormone injections, daily, self-administered, for weeks at a time, designed to stimulate the ovaries to produce multiple eggs simultaneously. It continues with a retrieval procedure performed under sedation in which those eggs are collected and then fertilized in a laboratory. It proceeds to a transfer, the placement of the resulting embryo into the uterus, and then to the waiting. The waiting, which every person who has been through this process will tell you is the hardest part. The 2 weeks between transfer and result, during which you are simply a person suspended between one life and another, not knowing yet which one you are living. And then the result. And then, if the result is not what you hoped, the decision about whether to try again. Jennifer Aniston tried again, and again, and again, across years that became a decade and then 2 decades, across a marriage and a divorce, and a period of being alone and another relationship, and another marriage and another divorce, the trying continued. She described it herself with a precision that suggests she has revisited these memories many times in the privacy of her own reflection. I was going through IVF, drinking Chinese teas, you name it. I was throwing everything at it. Chinese teas. It is a detail so specific and so human that it lands differently than the clinical language around it. Because Chinese herbal teas have been used in traditional medicine for centuries as a support for fertility, warming the body, regulating cycles, improving the conditions that Western medicine measures in different units. They are not a guarantee. They are not a replacement for the protocols Jennifer was simultaneously undergoing. But they are what a person does when they have tried everything the clinic can offer, and they are still looking for something, anything, that might tip the balance. They are what hope looks like when it has been going long enough to stop being naive and has become instead a form of stubbornness, a refusal to stop reaching, even when the reaching costs something. She was throwing everything at it. That phrase deserves to sit for a moment, because it is not the language of a woman who did not want children. It is not the language of a woman who was too focused on her career, too selfish, too committed to her freedom to make room for a family. It is the language of a woman who wanted something so much that she spent 20 years and the full resources of her body and her will and her hope in pursuit of it. Quietly, privately, without asking the world to acknowledge the effort or honor the grief when the effort fell short. She also said something else in that October 2025 conversation with Dax Shepard. Something that has the particular sting of a regret that arrived too late to be useful. I would have given anything if someone had said to me, "Freeze your eggs. Do yourself a favor. You just don't think it." Egg freezing, the process of preserving eggs at a younger age before fertility begins its natural decline, was not as established or as widely recommended in the early 2000s as it is today. The science existed, but the cultural conversation around it was limited. The medical community was not yet routinely advising young women who were not yet ready to have children to take the precautionary step that might protect their options later. And Jennifer Aniston, like millions of women of her generation, did not know to ask for what she was not being offered. She was, in this as in so many things, a woman navigating a landscape that had not been designed with her situation in mind, and paying the price for gaps in information that she could not have known existed until the moment she discovered she needed what was missing. During all of this, during the years of IVF cycles and Chinese teas and the particular private calendar of hope and disappointment that fertility treatment imposes on a life, the world was running its own parallel narrative. The bump watch continued. The magazine covers continued. The commentary about her choices, her priorities, her alleged refusal to embrace motherhood continued with a consistency that suggests no one involved ever stopped to consider that there might be information they did not have. She was also, during these years, building one of the most durable careers in Hollywood. The morning show on Apple TV Plus in which she plays a television news anchor navigating the aftermath of a public scandal, has been critically acclaimed and commercially successful, earning her further recognition and demonstrating, as if further demonstration were needed, that the woman who gave the world Rachel Green had depths that Rachel Green only began to suggest. She continued to work, continued to create, continued to build, not because she was choosing career over family, but because she was a person, living a full life, pursuing the things she wanted on multiple fronts simultaneously, as people do. And then, at 56, in October of 2025, she said the thing she had never said. So here I am today. The ship has sailed. 6 words, delivered not with bitterness, not with accusation, not with the performed equanimity of someone trying to convince themselves of something they have not yet fully accepted. Delivered with the quiet finality of a woman who has arrived, after 20 years of trying and grieving and hoping and trying again, at something that is not happiness exactly and is not resignation exactly, but is something more honest and more durable than either. Something that might, with the generosity of accurate language, be called peace. The ship has sailed, and she was the one who finally decided to say so out loud. But before Jennifer Aniston could find any peace with the story the world had written about her, she first had to survive the woman who had been writing stories about her longest, the one who knew her before any of this began. There are wounds that arrive from strangers, from headlines and tabloids, and the ambient cruelty of a culture that has decided a public figure is available for whatever use it wishes to make of them. Those wounds are real. They accumulate. They leave marks that take years to fully understand. And then there are the wounds that arrive from inside the house, from the person who was supposed to be the first safe place, from the voice that a child hears before any other voice, and that therefore gets wired into the architecture of the self in ways that no subsequent experience can entirely rewire. Those wounds are different, not necessarily larger, but deeper, more personal, more precisely shaped to fit the exact contours of who you are, because they were delivered by the person who knew those contours best. For Jennifer Aniston, that wound had a name, and that name was Nancy Dow. Nancy Dow was, by every account, a remarkable woman in her own right, a former actress and model of genuine beauty and intelligence, a woman who had her own ambitions and her own disappointments, and her own complicated relationship with the performing world that had shaped her sense of what mattered and what did not. She was also, as Jennifer described with careful honesty over many years, a mother whose love expressed itself in ways that did not always feel like love to the child receiving it. The criticism of Jennifer's appearance, delivered throughout childhood with the particular authority of a mother who believed she was being helpful, preparing her daughter for a world that would judge her by exactly these standards, left marks that Jennifer carried long into adulthood. The comparisons, the corrections, the steady low-level pressure of a woman who had decided that beauty was a currency and that her daughter's relationship to that currency required active management. Jennifer said later, with the measured honesty of someone who has spent considerable time in the territory of self-understanding, "It didn't instill a lot of security in how I felt about my physical appearance, just because she was kind of always telling me what to do and how to do it." That is a quiet sentence about a loud wound. The girl who would one day be considered one of the most beautiful women in the world grew up in a home where her appearance was not a given, not a comfort, but a project, where the mirror was not a neutral object, but an instrument of assessment, where the feedback was frequent and the approval was conditional, and the baseline was never quite firmly established enough to stand on without wobbling. And then Nancy Dow wrote a book. The title was From Mother and Daughter to Friends, a Memoir. It was a book about raising Jennifer, about the years of their shared life, the performances and the moves, and the complicated intimacy of a mother and daughter navigating the world alone together after a divorce. It was published with a timing that Jennifer could not have experienced as anything other than a particular kind of betrayal, in the same year that Jennifer married Brad Pitt. 2000, the year of the fairy tale wedding, the Malibu ceremony, the $1 million celebration, and also, quietly, the year her mother published a memoir about her without her blessing. Jennifer's response was absolute. She cut off contact with Nancy Dow. She did not read the book. Said so plainly, years later, when asked, "I've never looked at it." She did not engage with it publicly. She simply withdrew. Drew a line between herself and the woman who had crossed one, and held that line with the same quiet steadiness she would later apply to the tabloid narratives about her fertility. This was a pattern Jennifer Aniston had developed early and would deploy throughout her life. When a boundary was violated, she did not make a scene. She simply removed herself from the vicinity of the violation and stayed removed. What makes this moment more painful in retrospect is the timing. 2000 was also based on the 20-year timeline Jennifer revealed in October of 2025, the approximate period when she began pursuing IVF, which means that in the same year she was navigating the beginning of a private fertility journey. The hope and the hormones and the appointments and the particular emotional weight of wanting something so much. She was also processing the public exposure of her private life by her own mother, and the end of a relationship that, for all its complications, was the primary maternal bond of her life. She was carrying a great deal, and she was, as she would continue to do for the next 2 decades, carrying it without asking the world to notice. The estrangement lasted years. It lasted through the marriage and the divorce, and the Angelina Jolie era, and the sustained media assault, and the years of being the person the tabloids had decided represented a cautionary tale. It lasted through Jennifer's rebuilding of herself, the career, the friendships, the second marriage to Justin Theroux in August of 2015, the sense of a life being constructed with intention rather than inherited by default. Through all of it, Nancy Dow was not present. The first wound, the deepest wound, remained open. And then something shifted. Jennifer has been careful, in the years since, not to over-explain what changed or when. She has spoken about it in the oblique language of someone who is still processing something they may never fully resolve, which is perhaps the most honest way to speak about the reconciliation of a wound this old and this particular. What she has said is that the difficulty of what she was living, the sustained public judgment, the private grief of the fertility struggle, the accumulated weight of 20 years of trying and being misread and carrying more than anyone knew, led her, eventually, back toward her mother. She said of what came out of the difficult period, "It's always probably some really wonderful things that end up coming out of it." It is a sentence that says a great deal by saying very little, that suggests a woman who had found, in the wreckage of a complicated relationship, something worth recovering. That the difficulty itself had been the bridge back. Nancy Dow died in 2016. Jennifer and her mother had reconciled before the end. The estrangement that had begun in the year of the wedding and the book and the beginning of the fertility journey that had stretched across the years of the divorce and the headlines and the quiet private trying had, before it was too late, been resolved into something that, if not entirely healed, was at least no longer entirely broken. Jennifer did not speak extensively about her mother's death in public. She honored it with the same privacy with which she had honored most of the things that mattered most to her. But the reconciliation itself, the fact of it, the choice it represented, the decision to reach back toward the first relationship before it was permanently beyond reach, says something important about the woman Jennifer Aniston had become by that point in her life. She was not a woman who held grudges. She was a woman who held boundaries, firmly, clearly, for as long as they needed to be held. And then, when the time was right, she was capable of releasing them. That is not a small thing. That is, in its quiet way, a form of grace. And if the private wound of the mother had taken years to finally move toward healing, what would it take for Jennifer Aniston to address the public wound? The one that had been building, headline by headline, for 2 decades? There is a moment in every long silence when the silence itself becomes a form of complicity. Not complicity in the original wrong. Jennifer Aniston was never complicit in the narrative the world built about her. Never responsible for the story that was assembled from assumptions and projections and the tabloid industry's need to fill pages with content that felt personal enough to sell. She had not built that story. She had not fed it. She had, in fact, done everything in her power to starve it by refusing to engage with it, by holding her medical life as her own, by maintaining with remarkable consistency the position that her reproductive choices, or, as it turned out, her reproductive struggles, were not content available for public consumption. But silence, sustained long enough, can be misread, can be taken as agreement, can be absorbed into the narrative as its own kind of confirmation, as if the absence of denial is itself a form of confession. And after years and years of saying nothing while the world said everything, Jennifer Aniston reached a point in 2016 at which she decided that something needed to be said. Not about her fertility, not yet. Not in the full and detailed way that would come in October of 2025, but about the broader machinery, about the culture itself, about what it meant and what it cost to be a woman whose body was treated as public property by an industry built on the premise that famous women's bodies are exactly that. The trigger was specific and sufficiently absurd to have served as the final straw. Paparazzi photographs had circulated, suggesting that Jennifer Aniston appeared to have a baby bump. This was not a new occurrence. The bump watch had been a feature of her tabloid coverage for the better part of 15 years at that point. But something about this particular instance, in this particular moment of her life, landed differently. Perhaps she was simply tired. Perhaps the accumulation of years had finally reached a threshold. Perhaps she looked at those photographs and the coverage they generated and understood with sudden clarity that if she did not say something now, the silence would continue to be used against her indefinitely. She wrote an essay. She published it in the Huffington Post in July of 2016, and it was, by any measure, one of the most direct and carefully constructed public statements she had ever made. She did not mention her fertility struggles in the essay. That revelation would come 9 years later, in 2025. But she addressed, with precision and without performance, the culture that had made those struggles so much harder to bear. She wrote about the objectification of women's bodies. She wrote about the relentless public scrutiny of female appearances. She wrote about the way that women, famous and otherwise, are reduced to their physical selves, measured against standards they never agreed to, and found wanting by assessments they never invited. And then she wrote the sentence that became the center of the essay, the sentence that was quoted and shared and remembered in the years that followed, because it said something that needed saying with a clarity that cut through the usual diplomatic hedging of celebrity public statements. We are complete with or without a mate, with or without a child. We get to decide for ourselves what is beautiful when it comes to our bodies. We are complete with or without a child. She was not yet ready to tell the world why she did not have children. The 20 years of trying, the IVF, the Chinese teas, the grief carried in private while the world narrated a different story in public. But she was ready to say this, that the absence of a child does not constitute an absence of completeness, that a woman's worth is not a function of her reproductive history, that the question, the relentless, invasive, never-ending question, was based on a false premise from the beginning, and that she was no longer willing to allow that false premise to go uncontested. It was not the full truth. The full truth would come later, when she was ready to give it, but it was the truth she could offer in that moment, and it was enough to begin to shift something in the conversation, if not to end it entirely. The essay was received with a response that suggested it had touched something real. Women who were not celebrities, women who had never been on the cover of a magazine, women who had spent their own years navigating the same question. When are you having children? Why don't you have children? Don't you want children? Don't you think you'll regret not having children? Recognized in Jennifer Aniston's words a version of their own experience, stated with a platform and a precision they had not previously had access to. Because the bump watch and the tabloid fertility speculation were the celebrity-amplified version of something that millions of women live in quieter registers. The family dinner question, the colleague's casual assumption, the doctor who brings it up unprompted, the stranger who feels entitled to an opinion. Jennifer Aniston, in writing about her own experience, was inadvertently writing about theirs, and they knew it. In the years between the 2016 essay and the 2025 revelation, Jennifer continued to build and live and work with the same quiet determination that had always characterized her. The Morning Show, her Apple TV Plus drama in which she plays Alex Levy, a morning news anchor navigating a workplace scandal and its aftermath, had premiered in 2019 and had established her, definitively, as a dramatic actress of the first order. The performance was not a departure so much as a revelation, an exhibition of depths that had always been present in her work, but that the comedy register of Friends had perhaps obscured for audiences who had not been paying close enough attention. She had also, by this point, arrived at a kind of clarity about the fertility question that was not resignation, but was something more considered than hope. The IVF had not resulted in a pregnancy. The 20 years of trying had reached their natural conclusion, not by decision exactly, but by the accumulated weight of time and medical reality and the body's own limits, which are not negotiable regardless of how much you want to negotiate them. And she had arrived, slowly and without fanfare, at a place where she could begin to speak about what had happened, not to vindicate herself, not to indict the media, not to perform a catharsis for public consumption, but simply because the truth was hers, and she had been carrying it long enough, and the weight of it had perhaps become less than the weight of the silence. She said something in the 2025 Conversations that sits alongside the Huffington Post essay as its necessary companion, the fuller truth that the essay had been circling without yet being ready to name. But there comes a point when you can't not hear it. The narrative about how I won't have a baby, won't have a family, because I'm selfish, a workaholic. It does affect me. I'm just a human being. I'm just a human being, said by one of the most famous women on earth, a woman who had been treated as a symbol, a cautionary tale, a cultural referendum on female ambition and its alleged costs, with the simplicity of someone returning to the most basic true thing about themselves, after a very long time away from it. She was never a narrative. She was never a cautionary tale. She was never a referendum. She was a person, a specific, particular, irreducible person who had wanted something very much and had not been able to have it, and who had carried that grief with more dignity and more privacy than the situation had any right to demand of her. The essay in 2016 was the first door opening. The interviews in 2025 were the door thrown wide. And what came through that door, finally, after 20 years, was not scandal, and not confession, and not the tabloid catharsis the machine had always been hoping for. There is a particular kind of arrival that does not look like arrival. It does not come with fanfare or ceremony. It does not announce itself with the dramatic resolution that narratives, especially the kind of narratives that get written about famous women in magazines and tabloids and television panel discussions, tend to promise as the reward for surviving long enough. It comes quietly. It comes in the middle of an ordinary conversation, in a podcast studio or an interview chair, when a woman who has been carrying something for 20 years finally puts it down. Not because someone told her she could, not because the world has given her permission, but because she has decided, in the privacy of her own understanding, that the carrying is finished. Jennifer Aniston put it down in October of 2025, and the way she put it down was characteristic of everything she has always been: direct, unperformed, and more emotionally precise than the situation seemed to require of her. So here I am today. The ship has sailed. 6 words. And in those 6 words, an entire universe of meaning. Not defeat, not bitterness, not the performed acceptance of a woman trying to convince herself of something she has not yet fully processed, but the genuine, hard-won equanimity of someone who has traveled the full distance of a grief and arrived, finally, at the shore on the other side. The ship has sailed. It is an image of movement, not of loss. A ship that has sailed is not a ship that has sunk. It is a ship that has gone where it was going, somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the reach of the person standing on the dock, but moving, still moving, into its own future. The image she chose is not the image of something destroyed. It is the image of something released. Jennifer Aniston also said something else in those October conversations that has received perhaps less attention than it deserves. Something that sits alongside the IVF revelation, and the ship has sailed conclusion as the third essential truth of what she was offering. I've birthed a lot of things, and I mothered many things. It is a sentence worth sitting with, because it is not consolation prize language, not the defensive repositioning of a woman trying to find silver linings in disappointment. It is a genuine and considered accounting of a life. The friendships she has sustained for decades, with a loyalty and consistency that her closest companions have described, in terms that leave no room for doubt about their depth and their meaning. The career she has built and rebuilt and continued to build with the discipline and craft of someone who has never confused fame with work and has never stopped doing the work. The people she has held, publicly and privately, in the ways that friendship and connection and presence hold people, through their own difficulties and their own griefs and their own long silences. She has mothered many things. That is not nothing. That is, in many cases, everything. She also addressed in those same conversations the question that had shadowed her public image for years. The question of adoption, which well-meaning people had offered as a solution to a situation they had fundamentally misunderstood. Her answer was honest in a way that risked judgment and offered it anyway. When people say, "But you can adopt," I don't want to adopt. I want my own DNA in a little person. That's the only way. Selfish or not, whatever that is, I've wanted it. Selfish or not. She said it herself. Preemptively acknowledged the word that would be waiting in certain corners of the response to her honesty, and held the honesty anyway. Because what she was describing is not selfishness. It is specificity. It is the particular nature of a desire that does not lend itself to substitution. The wanting of a specific thing, not the general category of a thing, and the integrity to say so even when the saying invites misinterpretation. And then she said the final thing. The thing that closed the circle, not just of the October 2025 conversations, but of the entire 20-year story. Having children just wasn't in the plan, whatever the plan was. Whatever the plan was. There is a whole philosophy in that parenthetical, a recognition that the plan, the one she had, the one she pursued with everything she had for 20 years, turned out to be not entirely hers to execute. That life, in its actual operation, does not always honor the intentions we bring to it, however sincerely held or diligently pursued. That there is a version of acceptance that is not surrender, but is instead a form of wisdom. The understanding that you can want something completely and pursue it faithfully and still arrive at a different destination than the one you set out for, and that the arriving is not a failure. The world had told a story about Jennifer Aniston for 20 years. It was a story about a woman who made the wrong choice, who chose career over family, ambition over love, herself over the things that were supposed to matter most. It was a story told with tremendous confidence by people who had no access to the relevant facts, and it was accepted with tremendous credulity by an audience that had been offered no reason to question it. The true story, the one Jennifer Aniston finally told in October of 2025, is almost the precise inverse. It is a story about a woman who wanted what the world was accusing her of not wanting, who tried for 2 decades to have what the world was insisting she had rejected, who carried her grief in private, with a dignity that the situation had no right to demand of her, while the world narrated a parallel fiction that she never confirmed and never had the obligation to correct. She was right not to correct it. Her medical life was her own. Her grief was her own. The 20 years of trying were her own, not the world's content, not the tabloid industry's property, not a story owed to anyone who happened to be curious about what was happening behind the composed public face of one of the most famous women on earth. She told it when she was ready, on her terms, in her words, with the measured honesty of a woman who has always understood the difference between what is hers to give and what the world simply wants to take. Jennifer Aniston turns 57 in February of 2026. She is, by every available measure, a woman who has built something durable from materials that were not always cooperative, from a childhood that planted insecurity where confidence should have grown, from a marriage that ended in the most public and the most painful way imaginable, from 2 decades of private grief carried beneath the surface of a public life that showed no sign of the weight it was bearing. From all of that, she has made something that holds, something that is hers, something that no headline can accurately summarize and no narrative can fully contain. The ship has sailed, and she is standing on the shore, not watching it go with longing, not turned away from it in denial, but simply present. Here, in the life she actually has, which is not the life she planned for, and is not the life the world narrated for her, but is, in its quiet, earned, complicated, genuine way, entirely and completely her own. What does it mean to finally tell the truth, you have been carrying for 20 years. And what does it cost? And what does it give back when the world finally hears it? If Jennifer Aniston's story has moved you, if her dignity, her silence, her 20 years of private trying, and her quiet peace have said something to you about what it means to carry grief without letting it define you, leave a tribute for her in the comments below. She has earned everyone. And if you are here because you believe that the truth of a life matters more than the narrative built around it, subscribe to Golden Fame News, because that is the only kind of story we tell here.